everybody. Thank you very much for joining our panel. We will have in the next 1 hour 15 concentrate on the question on how to unlock social benefits of AI with privacy preserving protective technologies. And we have also the great task to keep you awake after the lunch break. So I hope that we will have a very, but I have no doubts with having in mind my panelists that it will be a very, very interesting discussion. My name is Ludmila. I'm from Google and I'm your moderator today. But your focus will be on this amazing panel we have today. We have the question of today will be how technologies can actually improve data protection around the world and drive better outcomes for individuals but also societies. We have the idea of this panel is to have different perspectives to encourage discussion. We tried to gather experts from both worlds, AI and privacy, and maybe also to merge them a little bit. And also I encourage you, if you have a question, we will have a Q&A session at the end, but please feel free just to take to step out to the microphone and to raise your question. I'm very happy to introduce my panelists today. We have Bojana Bellamy. She is the president of Center for Information Policy Leadership, CIPL. And Bojana has been around in privacy and security for the last 20 years. And she has, I hope everybody knows CIPL, if not just Google it. The think tank is located in Washington, London, and Brussels. And Bojana was, as I said, 20 years of experience and knowledge in data privacy, cybersecurity, compliance, and policy, but also quite a strong record in designing strategy and building and managing privacy and compliance programs. Next to her is Christian Dahunia, head of the private office of the European Data Protection Supervisor. And I'm very happy that Christian is a bit of the regulatory part of the world. Christian also developed the idea of digital ethics, exploring the geopolitics of rights and technology, and led the work on linking enforcement of privacy and competition law, online manipulation, misinformation, and the application of data protection rules in the area of scientific research. Christian was also working for the European Commission, and also for the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales. So we have a very knowledgeable person as well. Next to Christian, we have Cecilia Bonnefield-Dahl. She's Director General of Digital Europe. Digital Europe is the leading digital technology industry trade association representing over 35,000 digital companies in Europe. And Cecilia has been a member of the European Commission high-level expert group on artificial intelligence. He's also a board member of the European Commission Digital Skills and Jobs Coalition and of the Parliament-led European Internet Forum. We have Keith Enright. Keith Enright is Google's chief privacy officer and has been with Google since 2011. Keith has a long-standing history of privacy designing experience in industry, and also with Google, I think probably the most challenging job, one of the most challenging jobs in Google for the last nearly 8 years. And I'm very happy also to have Luciano Floridi, professor for philosophy and ethics of information at the University of Oxford, where he also directs the Digital Ethics Lab of the Oxford Internet Institute. And it's also very interesting because Luciano was also a member of the high-level group of AI of the European Commission, but he is also a Turing Fellow and chair of the data ethic groups of the Alan Turing Institute. And the expertise includes digital ethics, philosophy of information, and the philosophy of technology. He's also published several books like The Fourth Revolution, how the infosphere is reshaping human reality, but also The Logic of Information recently last year. This is sort of the presentation of the panelists, and I would ask Bojana to start a bit of to give us a kind of overview, having in mind your experience in the last 20 years. What can you take out of the privacy framework for AI, and what is your consideration maybe about this?
So thank you very much. I hope we have some slides. I apologize, but you know, it is 2:15 and our brains need all kinds of additional tools, old-fashioned PowerPoint. I wanted to share with you just some of the thoughts that we at CIPL have had about how we can kind of approach some of the challenges and risks in AI while actually still retaining the benefits. And why I suppose I'm here is just because we at CIPL have launched a new project about a year and a half ago looking at accountable AI practices. We have published the first paper talking about a tension between rules and technology, and now we're just about to publish second paper. Please look out for that as well, and do give us your comments on some of the solutions to these tensions. We will be engaging very much and would like to engage Cecilia with the high-level expert group, but the Commission and other stakeholders here, and Luciano, of course, to again provide some of the input into the way EU is considering EU regulation. And that input comes from a deep belief at CIPL that we cannot regulate everything by rules and by law. We have to actually put onus on organizations to be accountable and deliver accountable, responsible practices in the area of machine learning and AI as well. So our approach is really what I call layered approach. In the center, I believe we have got some really interesting rules that we can leverage from GDPR. GDPR has been around for some time now. Privacy officers are deploying some of the more innovative tools such as risk assessments, grounds for processing, balancing of rights, that can be also leveraged and deployed in the wider sphere of AI, transparency as well. We might want to also refer to some of the high-level expert group standards, or perhaps some sectoral rules that might one day come up. You have heard a lot of discussion whether we need to regulate specifically with some sectoral rules, facial recognition, or perhaps autonomous vehicles. So that is what I would call, to me, these are sort of, it's the first layer of kind of rules and standards of AI that I believe we have quite a lot. Second layer of this really is what we call organizational accountability, and I'd like to spend some time talking about that. We at CIPL have been supporting and promoting organizational digital responsibility and asking companies to really adopt best practices. And now I'm seeing those best practices also not just existing in the area of privacy program, but also around AI and machine learning. And so the question is, how can we all learn from the best in class, and how can we all deploy some of these useful tools, accountability tools? Perhaps caveat to say is that I view accountability as something that has to be delivered not just by organizations in private sector, but also public sector. Public sector is a huge user of data, and we want public authorities, when they are using AI tools, to also be able to demonstrate some of these best practices, to make sure they've done the fairness impact assessment, to make sure they've got accurate data, to have the governance models in place, perhaps even external, to look at these things. So that's very, very important. And second point on accountability is something that maybe we can pick up through questions as well. It's quite tricky to understand what are the roles and responsibilities of multiple players in the AI ecosystem. There are some who are developing the technologies and delivering AI as a service. There are some who are developing technologies internally. Some are selling it, some are implementing third-party technology to third-party companies. And I believe that all of these actors have got a role to play. They all must be accountable. So the question is, what does that accountability look like? And again, I'm seeing some positive market leaders, companies such as Accenture, IBM, and Google, which are setting some of the rules for the use of AI tools that they are developing by their clients or on the open market. And they don't need to do that legally, but they're doing it because the market is pushing them there. They want to be responsible, they want to be able to sell this technology, right? That is not going to bring somebody else in non-compliance. And I think these are really important elements of accountability. And then a final point of my layered approach is what I think is the need for new regulatory, innovative strategy, behaviors, and policy from the regulators and policymakers. We cannot regulate, nor oversee, nor progress AI and these new technologies by old-fashioned ways. So I would like to see development of regulatory sandboxes, for example, for AI. We are seeing excellent example of that in the UK by the UK Information Commissioner. I want more regulators, not just privacy ones, but others to deploy that. I would like regulators to think about cross-functional, cross-regulatory sandboxes as well. Again, we wrote a paper on sandboxes, and I hope, please refer to that on our website. There's some really interesting sort of thoughts there as to how we can take this forward. And then, of course, maybe regulatory hubs where regulators align together so that they all consider AI from their respective positions, but not a single one has got the overarching AI sort of, if you like, jurisdiction. So that is really what I wanted to say at the beginning. But maybe, Lucy, if I can just have a few comments about some of the accountability, because I would like us to focus on, again, what can organizations do to implement best practices around AI. Some of you may know what I'm showing now. This is the CIPL's accountability wheel. These are the elements of accountability that we believe organizations have to demonstrate in every area of digital responsibility. It started with privacy, and now what we are seeing is that some of the accountable best practices in AI, again, are following this model, right? There is a leadership and oversight, there are risk and benefits assessment, there are policies, procedures, tools and technologies to place and develop and train AI. There is enhanced transparency specific for AI, training and awareness, bringing culture, education, embedding the AI ethics and thinking in the organization. There is monitoring and verification. How is AI working? Are we doing tests post-deployment of technology? And then again, response and enforcement, human in the loop, redress for individuals, and how do we enforce rules internally? So I believe this model can work as a framework for AI, internal AI program or internal AI best practices. It doesn't mean companies will, or public sector will be doing this in addition and above, but they may be embedding this in their existing processes. So if we are doing a data privacy impact assessment where we are assessing risks and harms to individuals for privacy, we may also look at the benefits of processing. Well, we will at the same time consider the impact of the AI technology that we are using, which is processing data. We might be assessing impact on a wider human rights as well as just privacy. So again, leveraging these processes. If we have got chief privacy officer, maybe that privacy officer also becomes responsible AI lead. Or maybe it's a different person, but somebody at the board level has to have the complete oversight and understanding and confidence that we as an organization understand what we are developing and are accountable when these technologies are being deployed and used. And remember, this wheel, these elements have to be demonstrable to the regulators, to the shareholders, to the internal management as well, because our engineers may be developing technologies nobody understands, just like derivatives in 2008 financial crisis when the CEOs of banks did not understand what the clever mathematicians were creating in terms of swaps and derivatives and so on and so forth. So there is this parallel out there, and it has to be potentially enforceable as well. So I'm not shying away from that. If a company makes a promise that sits on their ethical values and says we are going to do this, and they don't do it, well, that could be enforceable as well, right? In a business-to-business context, also with regulators as well. So I really hope this could be a useful way forward. And Lucy, I would like to come back maybe and give some examples of what I'm seeing in the marketplace in some of these areas, because to me, it gives me confidence and it gives me optimism to know that there are engineers, privacy, other leaders in organizations actually working daily to develop some of these best practices around risk assessments, oversight, tools, technologies, and so I'd like to talk about that later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bojana. I have also the unpleasant task to be the timekeeper, so I'll be then looking at some panelists, maybe a bit of a more strict. I think it's a great overview and deep dive on how we can enhance from privacy tools we are using in privacy to AI. I would now go maybe to the other side to Cecilia. And Cecilia, you were part of the very exclusive high-level group of the Commission on AI. And so maybe you can elaborate the opposite, how the high-level group on AI was looking on privacy, so from the other angle.
Yeah. Thank you. So this is on now, yes. Thank you so much. So my name is Cecilia Bonefeld, and I'm the Director General, like it was said before, of Digital Europe. We represent around 35,000 companies in Europe. And those, of course, span all the way from a lot of SMEs all the way to huge companies. And speaking about privacy, of course, we look back at the implementation of GDPR. And it has not been easy for a lot of the smaller companies. It has not been easy. I think we can say about GDPR, it was a timely and extremely good regulation, but it was a tough implementation for a lot of the smaller companies. And why am I getting on that? I want to start by saying, let's learn. I mean, the ability to learn is what AI is also doing. So, but let's also learn from what happened with the GDPR, and let's actually try to avoid that effect with what we're doing on AI. And in that sense, I actually think being a part of the high-level group in the Commission, it's not been easy. It's a very diverse group. It has everything from NGOs to consumer organizations, from industry. Everybody's in the room. And just breaking down the barrier of how we speak and how we align has taken a long time. But what has come out is, of course, we don't agree on everything, even in the group, but, you know, it has actually been a very balanced approach. And I think what has come out of that approach also shows that sandboxing with multi-stakeholder approach on the regulatory agendas is what we need. Because through that process, we have involved hundreds and thousands of companies and institutions and member states in. And thank you, I guess that some of you in this room might actually have been giving feedback to the AI Alliance, and all that feedback is actually at the moment being worked in to whatever we did in that group. So let me return a little bit on saying what did we actually do. So the first deliverable was actually a deliverable of 7 main principles of artificial intelligence. And how to create trustworthy AI. We didn't want to call it ethical AI because it came into a discussion of what is ethical, and so we ended up saying trustworthy is better because it's more practical, it's operational, and what are the components that we need to consider. So here you go, here they are: transparency, robustness, safety, diversity, non-discrimination, human oversight, societal and environmental well-being, accountability and privacy, and data governance. So you will be able to read, if you Google it, you know, you can see all the principles described. But what we also did in the end was saying, like, well, this is not practical enough. And we tried to make an assessment list of questions. So for each of these, we have made a series of questions to answer. So institution, companies, SMEs can I kind of check their own, are we compliant? Have we thought about this? But one of the things that we also learned is that Europe is more fit for artificial intelligence than any other place. We have an extensive network of very granular regulations in place. So non-discrimination is a fundamental right, privacy is a fundamental right. We have safety law, liability laws. There is, I mean, we are still discussing. Of course, there will be some divergence in group of views, but it's very hard to actually find the gaps. And I want to make an example of how we just reviewed the privacy part of these questionnaires, taking into consider all the feedback that we had. And it actually moved up because we took all the ones that were linked, so non-discrimination and fundamental rights and all these, we actually took them at the top saying, if you can tick the box that I have implemented GDPR, well, you can tick the box, right? Then we've made a series of questions saying, you know, actually looking at GDPR, you need to consider when you do AI, these are the things that you really need to pay attention on. So, I mean, basically referring to specific things in the GDPR that you need to pay specifically attention to. But it has been very hard for us to actually find gaps. Then it can be discussed, okay, are there then, the next step, what we did was looking at how do you actually implement this? Implementation of governance, of course, if you have an SME and there are 25 people, I mean, the quality assurance function is probably overlapping with the development function and the product and service development function. But our aim is to produce something as simple as everybody can recognize themselves, and even though they don't have a big team working on it, they can still kind of use it and think about it and work it into the way that they are doing artificial intelligence. And just returning to what I said before, that is sandboxing to me. You know, involving thousands of companies in Europe and thinking through this and just checking and asking themselves the questions will actually bring innovation. It will bring them to think, okay, my application for solving energy consumption in XYZ, did I consider that I'm handling a lot of personal data and non-personal data? And how do I actually, I mean, what are the safety guards that I've put in place? So in that way, the thinking is changing before we just do new stuff. We actually use the existing legislation, we guide them to a way of thinking, which creates further innovation. And to me, it's more of a mindset that we need in Europe than it is that we need additional regulation. Another thing we did is that we looked also at unlocking the potential. I mean, how do we boost? How do we invest? How do we move forward? And these are some of the main recommendations that we came up with. So generating the appropriate skills, ensuring world-class research capabilities. And let me return to the public sector as a growth enabler. Right now we have member states, and maybe in their purchase patterns, they don't have any navigation on how to do procurement on AI. But now they have the principles. They can ask themselves, or they can even guide, saying, have you thought about these things when they actually go and purchase AI? So again, very simple tool can actually bring us to the next stage of artificial intelligence. So what are the next steps now of the group? We have now taken on board a lot of feedback into the assessment list and the first 7 principles. We are now doing deep dives with sectorial streams on healthcare. Actually, right now it's healthcare, public and manufacturing, because we have very limited resources, where we look at the recommendation and the usage of the 7 principles and the assessment list in a specific sector. And I believe that what we will learn is, for example, on transparency, if you go into manufacturing, there will be standards of transparency. There are already standards in place in most of the high-risk areas. And I think one of the key things that we need to do now is define high risk. What is high risk? I mean, what is high risk? It will differ from healthcare to public sector, but it will also differ from application to application. Some applications are just not high risk, and it doesn't really matter, and they are covered under any kind of existing framework. But what is actually high risk? And there we have to be extremely concrete. If not, we risk doing things for nothing and just adding things on top, extra regulation or something that really doesn't bring us any good. So that high risk definition is really key to going to the next stage. And then, of course, I mean, we should not forget one thing. We are the most well-equipped region to actually unlock the potential of finding AI solutions to solve the health problems, the environmental problems, because we have GDPR, we have the fundamental rights, we have our safety and liability rules. They are all in place. And now it's just about using them and understanding and actually being able to communicate to the thousands of SMEs how they apply them without like killing them up front, right, with regulatory compliance. And that is really the task that we stand in front of, if you ask me, on artificial intelligence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cecilia. We're getting there. So the idea is to bring at the beginning a bit of a different perspectives and hopefully together with each panelist a bit more practical. Hope we'll get there. I will ask now Christian, with your bit of a regulatory eye. You have been working on AI and GDPR and data processing, and the question of where you see the delta and how actually where for you, AI is data processing under GDPR, where you see examples that AI can help actually to develop this kind of privacy-preserving, enhancing technologies.
Thanks, Lucy, and thank you for having
maybe
me.
just a clarification. Everybody calls me on the panel Lucy. Don't get confused by this. This is my nickname.
With our best lawyers in EDPS, I drafted a specific disclaimer, which is very carefully worded, which I'll read out now. Nothing I say remotely represents the official position of the EDPS necessarily. I also wanted to make 3 points as a tribute to Terry Jones, one of the members of Monty Python who died. It's just been announced that he died today. And the best scene from The Holy Grail is where they throw the holy hand grenade at the killer rabbit, and they have to count to 3 before taking the pin out. Sorry, after taking the pin out and before throwing it. My 3 points are, first of all, demystification. We need to demystify artificial intelligence in order to analyze whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. The second thing is I'd like to talk briefly about what we mean by societal benefit, which is in the title of the panel. And then thirdly, I'll talk a bit about data protection and privacy and where it fits within this debate, in my opinion. When we talk about AI, we're basically talking about weak AI. We're not talking about general AI and terminators. We're talking about how it's used in real life situations, in finance, in education, in healthcare, and so on. There was a study at the end of last year regarding a major hospital in the United States where algorithms were, in effect, enabling white people with kidney problems and diabetes to jump the queue ahead of black people because the algorithm was leaning on data that reflected inequalities in society. So that's obviously a problem. Then there are other applications which seem to work. For example, content recognition. I use Shazam almost every day. It's very good at recognizing a piece of music. Facial recognition technology, which everyone's talking about now, is getting more and more accurate. Medical diagnoses based on scans. There was a report last week, I think Google published on that, and converting speech to text. But it's important that we demystify because we need to talk about real-life applications of this technology. And by giving it a label, we often lose sight of the fact that this is something which is being done. It's a tool which is being used by human beings, which has an impact, positive or negative, on other human beings and on the environment around us. 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been talking about AI on this panel, probably. We'd have been talking about big data. I think it's exactly the same thing. And if it's true that we're heading towards an AI winter, which a lot of people are predicting, I think that in 5 years' time, there will be some other catchphrase which will be used to justify massive data collection. My second point is societal benefit. For me, having worked in data protection for many years, data protection is all about context. It's not a prohibition on processing data. It's do it in this way if you have a particular purpose and if you've assessed the risks and if you're going to take responsibility for the consequences. Now, we're having this discussion now because digitization has happened very quickly in the last 20 years, but it's affected people very unevenly. There is an extraordinary report from the UN Commission on Trade and Development, published at the end of last year, on digitization, and it reveals how digitization around the world has, if anything, exacerbated existing inequalities and injustices in society. So really, when we talk about the social good or societal benefit, it's quite close to what the GDPR says about public interest. Recital 45 says that if, for your personal data processing, you're relying on public interest as a legal basis, then that needs to be set down somewhere in EU or member state law. And that's based on jurisprudence from the European Court of Justice. So whoever decides what is societal good or public interest is not private companies who are accountable to their shareholders, and it's not even NGOs who are accountable to their trustees, and it's not even data protection authorities. It's what's set down in law through a democratic process. I think that's a very important point. The danger that we have now is that the risks of these amazing technologies are socialized, so everybody bears the consequences of them, whereas the benefits are being increasingly privatized. Fewer and fewer people benefit from them. When I mention risks, I'll just mention three big things which are in the news pretty much every day. Surveillance. A year ago, Shoshana Zuboff was the star of the show here, promoting her book, Surveillance Capitalism. The fact is, generating data for AI, in effect, relies on surveillance. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's blanket surveillance, then it does become a bad thing. The second risk, which again will be familiar to everyone, is what you could call sort of social cohesion and democracy. We all know that the way that people consume content is often, is more and more dictated by, algorithms which determine what they see. You could say that that's an application of AI, and that it's exacerbating polarization. And thirdly, something which I think is going to become more and more pertinent, and people are going to become more and more aware of this aspect of digitization. It's the impact on the environment. That we still believe that sending an email is better than using a piece of paper. Not necessarily so, because the carbon footprint of data servers is increasing at precisely the moment that we should be decreasing our carbon footprint urgently. So those are three things that I think ought to be engaged with. And then finally, on data protection and AI. As Lucy said, EDPS 6 years ago now, we launched a debate on digital ethics. Before it was cool to do that, we published a background paper in 2016 for the what was then called the International Conference of Privacy Commissioners. It's now called the Global Privacy Assembly. And as a result of that, all of the global community of data protection commissioners have formed a working group, and they've adopted resolutions. So data protection authorities are really engaged with this subject. I won't go into a great enormous specifics about data protection law, but it seems to me there are 5 areas of data protection law which, for many applications of AI, are in tension. The first and an obvious one, which has already been mentioned by Cecilia and Bojana, is accountability. Data protection law revolves around the responsibility and accountability of the data controller. That's where the buck stops. If something goes wrong, it's the data controller who has to take responsibility for that. It's true that this concept is evolving. The GDPR has the concept of joint controller. There's a lot of debate about the relationship between controllers and processors, and we've got case law as well about companies which have pages on Facebook that they're joint controllers with Facebook. So that's a key thing in the debate about accountability. Whether or not it's a data protection issue, who takes responsibility for what the AI system does? The second area of tension is data minimization. That's one of the key principles of data protection that it's very tempting to ignore. Because the idea that you only process data when you need to, that's fundamental law of the EU, but it seems to conflict with the AI enthusiasm insofar as that those systems rely on personal data. Thirdly, purpose limitation. Obviously, a lot of data is collected not necessarily for the purpose that it's going to be used for in the autonomous system. Fourthly, data subject rights. You add a layer of complexity to the relationship between the data subject and the data controller when more and more responsibility is delegated to an autonomous machine. And then fifthly, Article 22, which talks about automated data processing decisions that flow from that. That's regarded by many people to be the AI article, but if you read it carefully, and there's some excellent scholarship on this, it may not necessarily be the key to responding to problems that arise as a result, the effects of the data processing that takes place through the AI system. I want to talk. We wanted to talk about data privacy enhancing technologies. There is one which seems relevant here. It's something called Claudette, which was developed by the European University Institute, which actually it's an AI system which enables, which does all the scanning of privacy policies, those hundreds of pages of legalese that nobody reads. It scans those in order to assess whether or not they are compliant and helpful. I just finished by saying we shouldn't use technology to solve social problems. The Commission was already aware of this in 1992. They always like to have the last word, so I'll quote them here. The result produced by the machine, using more and more sophisticated software and even expert systems, has an apparently objective and incontrovertible character to which a human decision maker may attach too much weight, thus abdicating his own responsibilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another perspective on AI and the privacy tools. So going now into the more practical approach, I would ask Keith, a bit of as representative of one of the biggest companies, how we heard about ethics, democracy, we heard about social benefits. But the question is how technology can be an ally, so a bit of to challenge Christian, can be an ally in data protection and privacy, and also how Google perceives from technical, engineering point of view, but also ethical point of view, using AI, which is a tool to embrace privacy, which is a right.
Sure. Thanks, Lucy. Can everyone hear me? Apologies. I am presently painfully reminded of the perils of being the fourth speaker on a panel of lucid and coherent and largely local speakers, because it leaves me at risk of sounding at best redundant and at worst completely uninteresting. It's exacerbated by the fact that the small part of my brain that is not presently disabled by crushing jet lag is tortured by the fact that there is an incredibly witty extension of Christian's metaphor about holy grenades and killer rabbits that is just beyond my grasp. I want to work it into my remarks, and I'm going to fail. But with that, I think it's helpful to walk it back a little bit and start with a recognition, I think a common theme that I've heard from some of the other speakers, that there is a tendency in society today to approach the relationship between technology and privacy with something of a false dichotomy. I think we presume that they are in tension, and we presume that as technology advances, so privacy will recede and privacy will inevitably suffer. And I want to push back on that for a minute. And the folks in this room are technically and from a policy perspective sophisticated enough to recognize we have the tools before us to step into a golden age of privacy. If as technologists and as policymakers, we can figure out a way to collaborate and get this right, we can leverage the benefits of things like encryption and differential privacy and other technological advances to actually allow people to not only secure their data than they've ever been able to before, but to have more control over it, to enjoy more transparency over it, and to derive more value from it in their everyday life. So that's sort of a common theme of my work at Google. That's what I aspire to, and that's something that I hope we can carry with us as we go through the remainder of the sessions here at this event. One of the things that I've observed that I think validates that, both through our remarks here and other panels that I've heard today, is there is an alignment of the underlying values that many of us come back to. Cecilia's remarks about the principles that surfaced in their work, serendipitously, are they closely aligned with the principles that Google has published around how we believe that AI and ML ought to be governed. And that commonality of principles, that similarity of underlying values, I think shows real promise of the fact that there is a path, there is a trajectory towards public and private sector collaborating, aligning, and getting this right. Our own CEO, Sundar, as I'm sure many of you saw earlier this week, actively sort of stepped forward and said, we support regulation of artificial intelligence and machine learning. We don't know exactly what that ought to look like. We have some ideas. We've tried to be active, responsible participants in that conversation, but it shouldn't be left to the Googles of the world to decide how to govern AI and ML. That's something that the democratic institutions of the societies within which we all live should be stepping forward and leading, and we should be one voice. We should be one contributor in that conversation, and we're committed to behaving responsibly in that regard and being part of that discussion. The way that I think that plays out and what we're trying to advance on this and what Sundar's remarks were trying to frame was, let's lean in to putting guardrails around this incredibly promising and exciting technology, but let's do it in a way that balances the societal benefits against the potential harms. Let's not artificially or irrationally allow our fear to constrain behavior in a way that prevents us from allowing the most users all over the world, irrespective of their economic circumstance or the hardware that they own or the bandwidth that they enjoy, to realize the benefits of technology. And the opportunity is right before us. We can do that. Privacy risks clearly need to be considered. I do think it's delusional to look at the state of technology today and suggest that there are not risks to be mitigated. I think the GDPR is one great catalyst. It has advanced programmatic maturity around privacy. One of my colleagues was on a panel immediately before this that was sort of really making the case that things are better in some respects today than they were years ago. And the GDPR is in large part to credit for that. It's advanced the conversation. Let's continue that work. And let's use all of the dynamism and all of the interest and all of the concern to recognize that there are very real reasons to be concerned, and there are tremendous opportunities to mitigate those risks and to do it in a way that allows people to realize the benefits of these technologies, because the benefits are potentially astonishing. I mean, some of the things that we've been talking about just in the last few weeks is using artificial intelligence and machine learning to make radical advances in our ability to deliver better medical outcomes through more accurate and more timely diagnoses. We're also seeing advances in our ability to predict severe weather instances. When you look at the potential of these technological advances to improve the human condition, to solve societal woes, it would be irresponsible of us to say, let's just shut all of this down because we're afraid. Let's instead recognize the opportunity and let's balance it against the very real risks that we're all aware of and we're all here to discuss, so that we can move forward responsibly and really unlock all of these values and deliver as much as we can from these great technologies. One recent framing that I saw, actually the ICO, I'm going to paraphrase this a little bit, but in the executive summary to the age-appropriate design code that they just published, that I'm sure many of you have been poring over feverishly as I have been, is they said something along the lines of, our intention here is to protect users while they realize the benefits of these technologies, not to protect them from these technologies. And I think that is a really fundamental distinction that we would all do well to sort of pause and reflect upon as we move into the work that we're all trying to move forward right now. Now, how does that all come back to Google and some of the practical things that we're doing and the things that we're working on today? if you look across the work that we're doing around leveraging our most advanced technologies to actually improve user privacy and improve user trust, not only in Google, but in the internet and in technology generally, because we think that's not only good for our shareholders, we think that's good for humanity. There are some common features that we try to make sure are present in all of our work and all of our efforts in these areas. We try to open source as much of it as we can. Some of the work that many of you are familiar with in terms of TensorFlow for federated learning. We are trying to allow our innovation to be accessible to engineers and technologists all over the world so that they can bring it home, they can bring it into their organizations, experiment with it, manipulate it, and try to innovate themselves with it to unlock new advances for privacy and data protection. We're right now really focused on doing more with less data. This is counterintuitive to a lot of people because the popular narrative is that companies like ours are trying to amass as much data as possible. That's simply not true, and it's less true every day, in that we recognize that data that we collect, we want to collect because it will allow us to create useful, wonderful products for customers around the world, but we do not want to hold on to data that isn't delivering value for users. It's a risk. So we're trying to use technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning to help us deliver more wonderful, more useful, more powerful experience for our users using the minimal amount of data possible, really leaning in on data minimization. We're looking for more opportunities to use on-device processing so that data is only shared with us, only shared in the cloud, or only shared with third parties when that's actually necessary to deliver the functionality that the user is looking for. That's not an appropriate approach to every single technological opportunity, but we're seeing more and more areas where on-device processing is a viable avenue to advance consumer privacy as the devices that we're carrying around with us every day are becoming more and more powerful and more capable. As I had said, we are trying to make the benefits of the technologies that we're discovering and that we're unlocking available as widely as possible around the globe. We do not want them to only be available to people that can afford an expensive piece of hardware or a high-speed bandwidth connection because of the benefits of the geography within which they find themselves. So we're really working hard to make these technologies globally deployable and consistent with the legal requirements and privacy protections of every regime within which we operate. Finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, we talked a little bit about differential privacy. We are looking at things like differential privacy and private join and compute to enable not only our own engineers, but engineers of the companies that we work with and we partner with and others in the ecosystem to derive new and innovative values from data to deliver great experiences from users and ultimately to allow users to be in more control of their personal information than they've ever been before by really pushing the needle forward with these new and innovative technologies that push control back to the users and enable them to only share data with us that they want to, that they intend to, and that they are comfortable sharing with us in order to enjoy the benefits of our services.
Can I just ask, maybe you threw in the discussion several elements. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar about federated learning, differentiated privacy. Maybe just with 2 sentences, if you can explain it.
Sure, and I will disclaim in the front end, I am not an engineer. People much smarter with propeller hats are sort of behind the engineering work of a lot of these things. Federated learning, as I understand it, is part of this effort to distribute the computing work for any particular initiative across multiple devices. It is one of many initiatives that we're working on to reduce the reliance upon sort of a centralized cloud infrastructure so that users don't have to share their data with us. They can actually keep more data on device and then rely on kind of peer-level computing to deliver the same kind of value, the same kind of services. Differential privacy, again, this allows organizations to derive insights and to do things with large data sets without actually sharing personally identifiable information. We're seeing a lot of opportunity in this area to allow for things like personalization, optimization, new kinds of efficiencies in products and services without requiring that people share personally identifiable information broadly.
Thank you very much. Luciano, we have now heard a lot of ethics, we've heard a lot of the values, but also practical examples on how you can use AI to enhance privacy by doing the processing on the device. And basically, the aggregated anonymous data is actually then used for the AI set. So the question is from another perspective now, from the ethical, philosophical perspective. Where do you see the current use of state-of-the-art, but also maybe elaborate on the developments and the limits and changes of these technologies? Where do you see it in the past time? Where do you see it now? The trade-offs. For example, just to give here an example on federated learning, is great because it's a privacy-enhancing technology by preserving the personal data on the device and sharing only anonymized aggregate data. But then it's the question of bias. And actually you have then the majority, but not the minority. So just to challenge you a bit and maybe to give us another yet perspective on this question.
Thank you. If it was difficult as penultimate, as ultimately becomes almost impossible not to repeat some of the things that have been said, with which I agree entirely, but also tell you something that you haven't heard before. Picking up from the historical, ethical perspective, and looking at some of the white hair in the room, you must know and you must remember that we have had this conversation for the past 35 years, shall we say 40. It wasn't called privacy protecting technology, it was called PET. And that's actually the entry in Wikipedia, privacy enhancing technologies. We had meetings, academics, who cares about them, in the 80s, just don't allow me to say anything more, about this. And in fact, the first literature on PET, privacy enhancing technologies, dates from the 90s. Now, what has changed, ethically speaking? Well, in the 90s, we were very concerned about governments. Remember, these are 90s, and if you just Google, when Google, Facebook, Twitter appeared, they were not there. We were very worried about regimes spying on us, controlling us, checking what we were doing, or some odd companies running things while we were using computers, the personal computers, those big things. So those days where the PET technology ethical debate was around, was all concentrating on making sure that we would be safe citizens. Now, a decade later, we started looking at online services, and all of a sudden the ethical debate has changed. Because, of course, at that point, we have also to be slightly concerned, or say mildly questioning what's happening to our data, not just on the government side, but also on the business side. And in this almost Julius Caesar moment when he's fighting the Gauls back and forward, if you don't remember your the Bello Gallico, please double check. So we are facing a double siege. Government on one side, business on the other, the citizen, allegedly the good people in the middle. Not so, because the PET technology stuff that was there, we never use it. I mean, if we look at the history of the technology for the past 35 or 40 years, how many people have actually endorsed that VPN, which is out there, or even use always the anonymous version of Google, which is actually there, available? How many of us, etc. So the history of PET is not a history of success so far, but it's a history of great potential. Of course, the risks are the ones already mentioned, so I will be very quick. And if you need an acronym, is FATME. I know it's memorable. Of course, FATME. FAT, as anyone knows, in terms of AI debate today, is fairness, accountability, and transparency. There are conferences and legions of articles on that. And ME is manipulation and explainability. So put together these 5 keywords, FATME, and you know that that is the debate for the past 30 years, augmented by not only the social services, but also the devices, including the one I'm wearing right now, which track us, tell us this, tell us that. A couple of days ago, I tried to get an app free for your diet, post-Christmas, and I just have to stop halfway through, because after all, I do this job. They cannot ask me so many questions. I mean, what do they care about what I'm reading these days? It's an app for a diet, for goodness sake. But that's the idea. And what lies behind this are, and I know that we're running out of time, 2 other points. One, where is the PET, the privacy enhancing technology burden, to be allocated? And again, the 30 or 40 years of debate have been circling around the usual 3 suspects. It's an engineering problem, very 90s. By default, at the source. And of course, if you read Article 25 of GDPR, that's exactly what it says. And it's an engineering problem. Therefore, shall we say, it's Google trouble. If they don't do it, well, that's their fault. And then, we move on and say, well, no, look, it's not just it can't be just an engineering problem. It has to be a regulation problem, because otherwise, who is going to invite the engineer to do the right thing, if not the laws of the country? And so we have the GDPR, etc. And so it becomes maybe not so much a default position, by design problem, privacy, AI included, but no, something that our society has to take care of. Self-regulation maybe, or perhaps new rules. Law implemented with teeth. So yes, maybe not, etc. But of course, there's a third sort of element here, which is the user. And every now and then, there's a conference where someone says, we need to empower the user, which, trust me, is just code for saying, if anything goes wrong, it's your fault. Because who really wants to be empowered, myself included, to protect my privacy all the time? At least in my own case, I haven't done that much or that well in the past 55 years. So these three is an engineer problem, is a society problem, is a user problem, and as the privacy by design, the privacy enhancing technologies have been going round and round, I said 2 points. The second one, and I'm closing here, is why? Well, because, and forgive me, we've been cracking this joke since the 80s, so it's an old one. We need to make the pet attractive. There has to be a reason for people to do that. Just being philosophically minded, as I would like to be, and appealing to the best of humanity. Surely we're going to do it. As engineers, as society, as users, remember the three sort of players here, because we are good people, because that's the right thing to do, because you will have consequences that will have a positive effect, because you will avoid problems that we should not run. Well, that line, I would like to leave it to my classroom at Oxford for a little while. Because actually the business model that we adopted in the 90s onwards doesn't really sort of match that. The business model is based on advertisement. Advertisement needs data, slim, agile, as minimal as possible, etc. But it does need to know about us. And therefore, we need to make it sure that is appealing to, for the engineer, for the society, for the users, to adopt pet. How? Well, for once, I'm not just sure that only sticks work. A lot of carrots too. So at some point, we should like to be able to show to everybody, business, society, users, that it's a better world, it's convenient. You are really enjoying a different kind of service. Not just because you don't get their fine or because you're not running that particular problem, but because maybe the service is faster, maybe because maybe it costs less, maybe because you do not have to run problems in terms of who is hijacking your elections or your referendum by any chance in an island on the other side of Calais. Well, that would be a world in which I would like to live. I'm afraid 35 years of failure of PET doesn't yet sort of provide much optimism, but surely we want to be at least mildly optimistic at the end of the day. I hope so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luciano. I think it's a very interesting perspective to think about of the three. Actually, there is not only the one perspective of industry or regulatory, but actually to think about design, deployment, or usage. This is kind of like to address all the different elements. It helps a bit to categorize the whole topic, and but also I'm trying to challenge a bit the panel, but also the audience. Oh, we have the first. Thank you very much for breaking the ice. Please just introduce yourself and then questions.
Yes. Thank you very much. My name is Dan Bogdanoff. I'm from a company called Cybernetica in Estonia. I've been trying to deploy privacy technologies for the last 12 years. I don't have gray, so my apologies for that. Sorry? Closer to the microphone. My apologies. So I don't have any gray in my hair. I've only done privacy tech for the last 12 years. These days, we can make technologies that have the same user experience as a typical system. So usability concerns can be amended. What I find as an interesting problem, and that comes back to the whole policy and society aspect, is when we propose adding a privacy technology to a system, then some of the public sector users, for example, say that this is complicated, it reduces our power over the data, and it's easier to pass regulation that just gives us the data. So this is an excuse that I have heard a number of times now, and they actually have passed regulation instead of going for a PET solution. So have we been late as technologists to the party, or can we somehow catch up with all these new services that are being built on biometrics, genomics, and what have you? Thank you.
Who want to take the question, or do you want to reflect a bit on this? Keith?
Sure. I think I've experienced some of what you're describing across the 20 or so years that I've been doing this. And at various times it's been attributed to different realities, I think, right? One is, yes, I think there has legitimately been a recognized historic technological overhead to many privacy-enhancing technologies. They either added complexity, or they added computational overhead, or there was some other tax associated with doing the more privacy-protective approach as opposed to the less. And this comes back to sort of the moment of optimism that I genuinely think that we're living in right now, in that I am being told by my technical experts that that headwind, the size of that tax, has dropped off precipitously in the last few years. In that it is now, we are at least approaching a moment where the ability to do things in a privacy-optimized way is not radically more expensive or slow or necessarily complicated than doing something that's less privacy-protective. I do think the user interface challenge is still a very real one. It is less about technical overhead in terms of the teams that I'm dealing with, and more about, we are perpetually and relentlessly now engaging with people all over the world, trying to understand their expectations when they engage with our technology. So we will present variations of a particular sign-up flow, an account creation flow, and then we will actually do qualitative analysis, sit down with people and have conversations with them. Which parts of this did you understand? Did this confuse you? Can you please help us sort of walk us through your journey so that we can optimize it to make sure that we are actually getting maximal understanding for all users everywhere in the world, in every demographic that we expect to be using our services. And that work is still very real and very ongoing, and I don't think we've solved that riddle yet. And I think that that is still a large part of the next wave of challenge around this, so that we are actually migrating people from experiences where they are self-selecting into less privacy-protective environments, into situations where they're actually empowered, they understand all of the consequences of the decisions that they're making, and they're moving into privacy-optimized situations. One other observation on this, which I do think is important, is there has been sort of this growing conversation over the last few years about dark patterns, right? There's this idea, the presumption that companies have incentives to nudge people in the direction of an account state that is optimized for the economic commercial interests of the entity sort of building the experience at the inevitable cost of the user that is sort of coming through that onboarding journey. We're reflecting on this ourselves right now. You know, the fact of the matter is, in much of the work that we do, we benefit more economically over the life cycle of a customer if they trust the service and if the service is behaving in a way that is consistent with their expectations. If a user ends up in an account state, or if their account is behaving, or if their experience of a service is inconsistent with what they thought it was when they went through that onboarding journey, that is not a good thing for us, even if there's some sort of incremental ad revenue that might have been realized at the front end of that, which there typically isn't. So we are working very, very hard right now to go through all of our consent flows, all of the interactions we have with our users, with a very keen eye to look for situations where one might misperceive that we have tried to nudge someone into a context where they haven't made decisions that they fully understand about their privacy, and make sure that we're correcting that behavior proactively so that we are being responsible actors in the space and we are helping users make the right privacy decisions for them, whether those are or aren't going to optimize sort of the economic outcome for Google.
I think Luciano also wanted to react on this question. If there are any questions, please use the micro. Go for. So.
Just a quick follow-up, which with reference to the users. It happens too often that in rooms like this, or any rooms like this, we really forget what the world is out there like. I mean, we have a big chunk of the population that can hardly read anything at all. I mean, including the summary of a newspaper. Now, these are the people you want to protect. Not the super bright Oxford student, shall we say, who knows exactly how to even write those lines of code to make sure that such and such is working properly. Now, in terms of the most vulnerable and is huge chunk of the population of users, then it's good that the engineers are taking responsibility and society as well. But I think that there's I know that I presented this as a three-party kind of game. There is a fourth element here that would be interesting to explore, namely the possibility of generating conditions such that third parties are interested in protecting, shall we say, even leveraging the privacy of those who cannot protect their privacy for their benefit. Like, well, think about data portability. Data portability is not about me actually downloading my data, going somewhere, asking for a different electricity, etc., etc. No, it's about another company being able to leverage that possibility to make sure that I get a simple offer saying, if you come to me, your contract will be half of the money. So, okay, I can do that. So imagine tomorrow another online service saying, ping, Luciano, we have just got all your data, and actually, if you come with us, we halve the consumption of privacy in your case. Same service, even better. Well, I might switch. So let me make this simple. Imagine a world in which it's not just 3, but 4. There's another element, a third party that is interested in protecting the privacy of the most vulnerable people in the room for their own benefit. At that point, there's interest. And finally, the mechanism may actually start moving ahead. Someone has an interest in protecting someone else's privacy. That sounds to me a way forward.
Thank you very much. There were also some reaction on the panels, but I'll take first of all the question because audience is more important. Sorry.
Thanks. Thiago from the DPS. My question is about the interaction between initiatives like AI explainability, and I think Google has a recent project on that, and how these interactive privacy-preserving technologies. I mean, I'm aware of federated machine learning, but I'm not sure if it's also being considering the AI explainability project of Google, and of course, if any of you can share whatever you know between the mixing of these two fields, I would be interested.
Thank you. Maybe first, because Keith, you're talking, I would like to give the floor to the others a bit and then to come back to this question, if that's fine for you. Bojana, you wanted to react before on the other?
Gosh, that question threw me off. Now, what I wanted to react is something that Luciano, you have said, which is, and I think it links to what I've been trying to advocate here. If we really want to get the benefits of the technologies and give people value from the technology, which is what you have said, Keith, we really have to shift from this onus on, you need to control, you are in charge, as opposed to we are responsible to use your data and to deliver the value in the way that benefits you, society, and frankly us. So that's what accountability is, right? And it's that shift. And I know in places like this we always talk about individuals and users, but really I'm saying the buck starts with those who are using information, using data, and creating technology. And for them, it's not a matter of legal compliance anymore, because it's about users, it's about trust, it's about customer relationship. Just like you would want to make sure your users get the best of your service or even if you're government, right? Well, that's the same as with privacy. And I think that's where we, organizations, have to shift our mind. And I don't think, to Pat's point, I don't think that pets or privacy-enhancing technologies can solve all of this. It's a combination of things. It's technologies, tools, processes, governance, and those best practices. All of that together is something that governments and policymakers must take into account and incentivize. But on the point on explainability, I think UK is doing some really interesting work. UK Information Commissioner with Turing Institute on Explainable AI project. What I have seen again from practices as we have been collecting from organizations is that many organizations who are leading on AI are trying to understand this explainability point, and it's beyond transparency and it's different from transparency. It's about traceability, it's about making black box into glass box, it's about auditing and ensuring that the consequences and the impacts of processing actually are the right ones and checking what happens post facto. So, and then being able to actually explain that to individuals or to the regulators, because to me it's not just explainability to individuals, it's explainability to some of your stakeholders, could be civil society, could be your leadership, and could be society at large.
Okay, there is a better timekeeper than me. So it's Keith, do you want to reply to this one particular question?
Sure, I'll try to keep it brief because I feel like I'm dominating here. Yeah, so I think as Bojana set it up, the notion of accountability is a great jumping off point for talking about the relationship between AI explainability and the ethical and responsible use of these technologies. One hypothetical that I had heard laid out over the last few years repeatedly is, again, this sort of binary situation of some point in the future where an individual is facing a medical diagnosis and they're posed with two options. You know, we can use system A to produce your diagnosis with a 67% point rate of accuracy, but we can explain it to you crystal clearly in human language. We can explain to you sort of all the inputs, all the outputs, and how we deduce the diagnosis. Or we can use option B, which is completely inscrutable. We're not even entirely sure how it works, but we have enough data over a long enough period of time to know that it's producing a 98% reliable outcome, that the diagnosis is far, far, far more accurate. And you know, where are people going to choose to exist on that spectrum? I think we're going to see a pretty clear gravitation towards option B. That's not the end of the story, though, right? Like, our responsibility isn't discarded simply because we may be able to produce better outcomes. We almost certainly will be able to produce better outcomes in certain limited circumstances using techniques and means that are extraordinarily hard to explain in human discernible terms. That actually just throws down the gauntlet, I think. That raises the stakes for organizations like ours and for others who have committed themselves to being leaders in artificial intelligence and machine learning to determine, as Bojana says, if we cannot explain in sort of historically relevant terms how something is working, we need to figure out a better way. We need to figure out a better way to demonstrate organizational accountability to prove with a high level of confidence that those systems are operating in a manner that is consistent with the values and the constraints that we have laid out and we've publicly committed to. And we need to work with public sector actors, with policymakers, with academics and others to advance that conversation so that we're behaving responsibly.
Thank you. I would like to give Cecilia and Christian a few more minutes as maybe to recap, but also a bit of your thoughts, because I saw you grabbing the micro to react either on the questions or on what the panelists said. I know we didn't touch on a lot of other topics, which I would love to, like facial recognition and also surveillance of the question, but maybe Cecilia, you wanted to react on one particular question?
I think just one thing on accountability. I mean, it's not that first of all, AI is not a new thing, and second of all, I'm not sure that there are huge changes in the accountability concepts due to artificial intelligence. We still have the same accountability concepts, legal requirements, liability rules that we have always had. It might be a new interpretation, and we need to be able to explain exactly how we use it. But this is much more about interpretation and enforcement of what we have than necessarily reinventing the wheel. And the second thing is transparency and explainability. Of course, also have to be differentiated compared to the risk that it has. And if we look at the health area, I mean, this is a very advanced area in risk assessment, in accountability, in setting of standards. So again, let's look at what we have, and let's not pretend that we are entering a world of a blank page and have to invent all the new things all over again.
Thank you. Christian? And then a final question to all.
Thanks. Yeah, just three more little things. Another application of AI is something as trivial as chatbots. So that's why we can't see these technologies in isolation. It's how they're being used and why they're being used and who's subject to it and who benefits from it. So like the disturbing thing that I see personally is that poor people have to deal with machines and computers the more things get automated, and people with enough money and status in society, they can still deal with real people if they have a problem. And that's a tendency which, you know, as budgets get stretched and states are looking for ways of economizing, that's going to be a collateral problem. Second little point is on accountability. One of the barriers to accountability is secrecy. It's like corporate secrecy. If you don't know what's going on in a company, if you're not able to see and scrutinize how an algorithm works, then how can you really be accountable? The third thing is we've been doing a lot of work trying to encourage different regulators to talk to each other. We set up something called the Digital Clearinghouse, particularly those responsible for regulating digital economy, so consumer authorities, competition authorities, data protection authorities. I think with AI, we're really thinking about product safety. Food, drugs, heavily regulated. You can't put something on the market unless you're absolutely sure it's not going to harm anyone. We're not there yet at all with digital technology. The Boeing 737 MAX is grounded around the world at the moment because of safety concerns. We need to get to that point with algorithms too.
Thank you very much. I'll ask the panelists for maybe one last sentence and maybe one sector they think that AI has to be applied where the non-application is more risky than the application. And maybe one sentence you want to give a wisdom to the audience.
So I actually am a huge proponent of AI in health. We've seen data which shows, in fact, AI performs better than doctors. In fact, AI performs better even than judiciary because judges are impacted by the time of the day when they make decisions in terms of consistency. So I do want to kind of make one point, which is to Christian particularly. Maybe we will get more comfortable with decisions being made by machines because, in fact, they will be, over time, more objective than my mind, my black box, as a human. I know it's controversial, but I think we will get there. And certainly in health, I'm huge. I think the reticence
One
risk
sentence.
is what I talked about.
One sentence.
It will be worse not to do it than to do it.
Christian?
I think I've said
One
enough.
sector you think AI has to be applied, but because it's
But
more...
it has to be applied.
Yes, because it will be more risky not to apply it.
I don't know. Football?
Football. Great. Cecilia.
I mean, with the Green Deal, I think I will choose environment. I'm super
Great.
concerned as a person also about the environmental situation. So I think I will choose this one because it's really about common good. And it's not only about common good, it's about safety. It's about the sustainability of mankind.
That's great. Keith?
Sure. I mean, I'm biased on this one. My mother is a breast cancer survivor, so I'm emotionally activated when I see the announcements that our company is making around the ability to do earlier diagnosis more accurately. And I am an extremely strong supporter that while we should do it in a privacy protective way, we are being irresponsible to millions of people around the world if we don't figure out some way to deliver this benefit as broadly as we can.
Luciano?
All of the above, and making us way, way more intelligent.
So we have football, environment, we have judiciary, amazing. So I'll thank you very much. I don't see any questions, otherwise just take the panelists after the panel. I think it was, for me personally, very interesting to deep dive the different perspective from philosophical, practical, think tank, academical, for the trade association and a regulatory approach. I like the category of usage, deployment, and design, and I think we all agree it's about AI is a tool and privacy is a right. So there are two different things. And how do we apply this tool? So deployment, the ethical deployment is actually the key question. So the question of common values. And also privacy by design and how AI could help privacy-enhancing technologies or privacy-preserving technology, but also the trade-offs we have to do when we do it in this way. The question of big data coming back, I have never heard this for the last 5 years, but thank you, Christian, for bringing this back. The question of quality versus quantity of the data, I think we have a lot to think of. Thank you very much. Thank you for your interest, and have a great afternoon.